Starting at guard, a noun, a group acting together as a whole to achieve greatness. Collective. At forward, a noun, the game of skill, speed, and strategy played on the hardwood, and the conflict at the center of a galactic showdown between cartoons and aliens. Basketball! And anchoring the paint, a noun, a negotiated understanding between parties. From peace treaties to pick and rolls, human beings must reach them before turning ideas into reality. Agreements. And now, your host of the Collective Basketball Agreements podcast from Syracuse, New York, journalist, lawyer, business person, brother, son, and friend, Joe Manganiello.
Hello and welcome to the Collective Basketball Agreements podcast. I am your host, Joe Manganiello. Today we're going to get into some NBA content, some previews of the 2025 offseason. The NBA's moratorium period is the end of June, and so by early July, that's when new business for the 25-26 season kicks off. During that opening week called the moratorium, signings, trades are typically announced, leaked through sources, but are not made official until July 8th of 2025 this year. And to get us started, today we're going to talk about three teams from the Eastern Conference: the Atlanta Hawks, the Boston Celtics, and the Brooklyn Nets. These are three teams in very, very different situations, and I think it'll be an opportunity to talk about the different stages of team building. And under this new CBA, which saw the implementation of a second apron, which we can talk a little bit more about what that means. And in general, under this CBA, we're seeing much more spending power. Salary cap set to rise 10%. We actually just got that official report. Bobby Marks of ESPN tweeted out on March 25th. To no surprise, NBA teams notified salary cap for the 25-26 season is expected to increase 10%. The plan is to smoothly raise that salary cap 10% each year for at least the next 4 or 5 years. And that windfall of cash, right? So the collectively bargained agreement between the players' union and the team's management ownership dictates that about half of all basketball-related income has to go to the players in the form of player salaries that are legal under the CBA. And with so much new money coming from the national television deal over the next 11 years, $76 billion. And that's just one source of basketball-related income. Now, notably, not every dollar in the business of basketball counts as BRI, but to keep things super simple, an average of $7.6 billion a year over the next 11 years coming in for that TV money. About half of that has to go to the players, and so we're going to see salaries rise. The salary cap for next season in the NBA, $154.6 million. The luxury tax line is above that at $187.9. So why don't we just stop there? Every team is permitted to spend $154.6 million. It's a soft cap in the NBA, so that means that even though the NBA demarcates $154.6 million, that's the team salary cap, you can go above that through exceptions and other permissions. But the luxury tax line, 187.9. So if you spend about $33 million over the team salary cap, now all of a sudden you're in the tax. And at a high level, whether or not a team is willing to go into the tax can really be boiled down to how important is it to be a non-tax team which qualifies you to receive an equal share of the luxury tax payments. So we've seen teams like the Los Angeles Clippers, the Golden State Warriors, the Boston Celtics spend lots and lots of money, well over the team salary cap, well into the tax. And now, in the new CBA environment, we have multiple aprons, right? So the illusion, right, an apron in the kitchen, you wear it so that you don't get your shirt messy. If a team goes well above the salary cap, over the luxury tax, the first apron, which there was a first apron concept in the previous CBA, that line is at $195.9 million. So if you find yourself spending not just above the tax, but now you're over the first apron, there are certain restrictions now. And so you have to be careful if you're a team even approaching the first apron. And then the second apron is even more punitive. And I think that in a different episode, it might be worth going really line by line on what are those restrictions, what are those penalties. I'm going to try to do these team previews more organic, more free-flowing, so that each team sort of gets its own set of things to look for, priorities, and we can contextualize the circumstances for each team. That second apron is $207.8 million. So a team like the Boston Celtics, we'll get into momentarily, they're well above the second apron. So that means that they're already projected to be spending well over $50 million above the salary cap, tens of millions of dollars over the luxury tax, and even tens of millions of dollars over the first apron and above the second apron. There are a lot of penalties that come with that, but when you're competing for titles, and they won the championship last year, this is a trade-off that you make as a business, where you say, you know what, our ticket sales, our sponsorship opportunities, and the prestige of the franchise winning championships, competing at the highest level, playing on national television, playing in nationally televised playoff games April, May, and June, that is good for business. We're willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year in payroll. So we'll talk more about that. Salary cap this current season, $140.6 million. It rises to $154.6 million. And teams have been operating under that assumption. So a lot of the work that we're going to do today in forecasting has been based on numbers. Now we know they'll be official, but these numbers have been in the air for a while. Now, in talking about NBA regular season basketball, it's not that the games at the end of March and April are meaningless, but certainly the results can get very, very wonky. And so as I was doing my research for all these team previews, and we're going to get to all 30 teams over the next several weeks, I actually kind of I wanted to draw a line in the sand and say, all right, as of March 24th, here's what the numbers say based on team ratings, based on wins and losses and projections. And hopefully, even as these episodes come out week after week, that will create some uniformity. We'll sort of capture the NBA as it was at the end of March, as things were really starting to reveal themselves. There's only so much drama left in the numbers. And quite frankly, we're going to see teams in the mediocre to bad ranks that just totally bottom out in these last few weeks. I mean, quite frankly, we've already been seeing it. So, around the 70-game sample, I think is kind of plenty to be able to say with some definition, this is what this team season was, and this is how we should be thinking about their offseason. So with that in mind, the Atlanta Hawks, as of March 24th, they were 35-36. This is a team that is routinely at that 500 level. 500 or one game above or one game below. That's sort of been the story for this Hawks team for many years in a row now. But in the Eastern Conference, that gets you in the playoff mix for sure. As of March 24th, they were 7th in the NBA's Eastern Conference. They should certainly make that play-in round and have an opportunity to crash the party, make it to the first round, maybe win a few games. And, not for nothing, but hosting playoff games is a very lucrative thing for ticket sales and, event-based sponsorship opportunities. And so for these businesses, a home playoff game could represent $2, $3, $4 million in profits, which, is important, is an important consideration for ownership, management, everybody on the corporate sales side of these franchises. And if you're in the Eastern Conference, it's really hard to get all the way to the bottom. We'll talk about some of these teams, the Wizards, what the Sixers and Raptors have been doing in recent weeks just to get increased lottery odds. If you're Atlanta, you're just too good to be bad. And I think that in a way kind of represents these last 4 or 5 years. The Hawks were able to go to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2021. And I think in many ways they have been a team obsessed with that result and convinced that a season like that is just around the corner if they stick the course. Trae Young as a franchise player, one of the best passers in the NBA, someone who can create offense no matter who's on the floor with him. Ideally you give him a pick and roll partner at the 5 spot that can crash the rim, provide some offensive rebounding, alley-oop threat. We're going to talk about Clint Capela. We're going to talk about Onyeka Okongwu. But let's go through the fundamentals here. Per Cleaning the Glass, which is a great service, has some free features as well as paid features. But Cleaning the Glass, famously, Ben Falk is the creator. It strips away garbage time, so it tracks statistics rooted in competitive portions of NBA games. And so based on Cleaning the Glass, as of March 24th, the Atlanta Hawks, their expected wins per 82 games, 38.2. So they were 35-36 as of March 24th, projected to only win a few more games, but again, they're going to be comfortably in that play-in round mix. Offensive rating of 114.5. That's 114.5 points per 100 possessions. That's 17th in the NBA. So they've been an average offensive team this season. And similarly, they've been an average defensive team. Defensive rating, 115.6. That's 17th. Their net rating, so per 100 possessions, if you picked any 100 possession sample for the Atlanta Hawks, the prediction would be that they would be about negative 1.1, which is average to below average. It's not terrible. Obviously, you don't want to lose over any sample, right? So if you're negative 1.1 over a 100 possession sample, that's not great. And again, I think this has been the story for this Atlanta team over an extended period of time. Notably, though, this is the worst offensive rating a Trae Young team has had since the 1920 season, and Atlanta was still firmly in their rebuild at that time. For those curious, their winning percentage, 56.9% in the 2021 season, 52.4% of their games the following year. They were a 500 basketball team the 22-23 season. Last year, they dropped to 43.9. And again, it looks like they're going to be, right around 500, maybe, slightly below that this season. Let's look at their financial fundamentals for the 25-26 season. They have 10 contracts under team control. I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. They are not set to have any restricted free agents. They do not have any player options or early termination options that they have to deal with on the player side. And they have 4 cap holds. Cap holds mean that a player is set to become a free agent of some kind. The cap hold represents, it's a representative salary that has to be on the cap sheet, has to work against the cap sheet until there's a resolution on that player's new salary. And of course, if the player goes to another team in free agency, then that cap hold would come off the books for Atlanta. I'm a subscriber to Dunked On Prime, so I love using their cap sheets in addition to Spotrac's publicly accessible data. And so Dunked On projects that Atlanta is going to be, kind of right around, neutral in terms of cap space, projected to have about $1 million in cap space, which really means you don't have cap space. The way that the soft cap environment works is you have to order your transactions in the month of July so that you declare from your first action, we're operating as a cap space team or we're operating as an over the cap team. In Atlanta's case, it wouldn't be all that helpful to them to be a cap space team. Maybe they could get clever, find a way to use the room exception, which is a lower salary slot that teams that use cap space can offer. But I think at this stage, and sort of for the purposes of doing these previews months out, right? We're talking about transactions and planning for July of 2025, August of 2025 for any, off-season trades. Maybe we'll talk about Trae Young's trade market. I think for this exercise, we have to take a more holistic approach and ask ourselves, how is the Trae Young business going for Atlanta? Trae Young is their most expensive player. He's their franchise player, set to make $46 million next season. He then has a player option for 26-27. Now, in rounding out the financial fundamentals here, Atlanta is only about $30 million clear of the tax line. So it's going to be difficult for them to make significant moves taking on any money. They don't want to get themselves into the tax. Certainly, they don't want to trigger any of the aprons if they can avoid it. They also are set to have draft picks in 2025, not their own, but they are likely keeping the Kings pick, as well as owning the Clippers pick. These are going to probably slot somewhere between the end of the lottery, maybe 13 or 14 for the Kings pick. The Clippers pick is going to probably be somewhere in the low 20s. So when you add up these player salaries, both of these rookies probably going to make something like $10 million in salary. And then again, I don't think that they're going to be a significant cap space team unless they were able to trade out of some other salary. So I think by and large, they're going to be making smaller moves that can work within either, traded player exceptions or salary cap exceptions. They're going to retain a lot of their core talent, most likely. My guess is that they're going to, at least one more time, trot out a roster built around Trae Young and see where that can take them in the Eastern Conference a year from now. Hopefully, Jalen Johnson gets back on the floor. He had a torn labrum that ended his season, but by all accounts, he's going to be back playing at a high level. This has been one of the most exciting teammates that we've seen Atlanta put around Trae Young. Such a dynamic, athletic forward, someone that can initiate some offense, a good shooter, a good playmaker, a lot of potential there. But let's get back to Trae Young. I keep kind of dancing around the elephant in the room, which is that it is nearly extension time for Trae Young. So he has one more guaranteed season, and then, as I mentioned, he has a player option for 26-27. When a player signs their rookie scale extension, which Trae Young did back in 2022, he signed a 5-year deal, $215 million, and that player option in year 5. when a player like Young has 1 year left on their deal ahead of a player option, that timing can trigger discussions on a new extension. What that would look like is Trae Young would opt out or would decline his player option and then extend his deal into the future based on the agreed upon amount. So let's say the Hawks are assessing whether or not they should give Trae Young a new contract. For the 2025-26 season, the salary cap being a projected, or now official, $154.6 million, Trae Young would be entitled to 30% of that, which would be around $46 million. Trae Young's player option in the 26-27 season is $48.9, just under $49 million a year. But if he opted out of that and started a new deal, starting at 30% of the salary cap for the 26-27 season, that projected amount would be $51 million. So Trae Young could then have his salary bumped up to $51 million by starting an extension, and then it would be 8% raises on top of that amount every season. So if it was a 4-year extension, let's say, this means it could be a 4-year, $229 million deal. You know, if it was only a 3-year deal, it'd be less overall money, but you know, you can do the math starting at $51 million, 8% raises over each of those 4 years, $229 million. And the very fair next question is, does Atlanta want to pay Trae Young $229 million over those 4 years? That will take Trae Young into his 30s, into his early 30s. He's a smaller player. He is one of the least advantaged defensive players in the entire NBA. And so as great as he is offensively, there is a real question on how far can the Trae Young team go. Yes, they made the Eastern Conference Finals in 2021, but suddenly that was 4 years ago. And so short of them making a similar run this spring, I don't think you can assume that another semifinals run is just around the corner. Even if Jalen Johnson comes back healthy next year, and even if last season's number 1 overall pick, Zachary Risachet, takes a huge step up in year 2 and then year 3, even if Dyson Daniels continues to be the best perimeter defender in the NBA more or less and stealing 2 to 3 steals per game, like even in the best case scenario with some of these developmental projects, Trae Young gets paid the big bucks and in turn is the most consequential player. So you can, in my opinion, you can really boil things down to how much faith do you have in Trae Young as your franchise star. Now, my younger brother is a huge Atlanta Hawks fan, is a huge Trae Young fan. And so I would be remiss if I didn't interject on his behalf and say, Joe, stop being so pessimistic. We want Trae Young. Trae Young is one of the singular offensive talents in the game. We're not getting rid of him. There isn't a fair trade out there. If he wants the extension, then Atlanta should give him the extension. Alternatively, if Trae Young was not willing to take the extension, if he was more inclined to play out the 25-26 season, and then he would have a player option that he would be able to decide ahead of free agency in 2026, now Atlanta is in a precarious situation where, you know, I mentioned at the top they have 10 contracts under team control for this year. Well, if you lose that control, that guarantee over Trae Young being on the Atlanta Hawks, now all of a sudden trading him and being proactive makes more sense. And then alternatively, if Trae Young isn't interested in taking the $229 million extension, he may also go to Atlanta's management and say, you know what, I think it's time that y'all trade me so that I can get traded somewhere and then sign an extension. And just as a reference point, we just saw this past season, De'Aaron Fox, lottery pick for Sacramento, has played his whole career in Sacramento. As a player with 7 to 9 years of service, he's entitled to the 30% max. And he is due for an extension this summer. And so his representation, Rich Paul, Clutch Sports, worked behind the scenes, by all reports, with Sacramento to get Fox traded to the San Antonio Spurs, where De'Aaron Fox would prefer to play long term. And now he is eligible to sign an extension with San Antonio this summer. So you can see how there's some interplay between agents, teams, and players, or players and their agents and the teams, because everything is relationship based. Everything is everything. And a team would do right by a player, even if that meant trading them away, because it sets up future dialogue between them and that agent and any other players that that agent represents. And then you think about how stories get to the media, how we find out about things as the public. And you can start to do the math, right? A lot of the stories that we hear are based on either the team or the player's agent making sure that the press learns about certain things. Now, in Atlanta, I don't know that there has been a ton of discontent or a ton of troubles between Trae and Atlanta. By all accounts, Atlanta has done right by him at every turn. They have built a roster where he has lob threats at the center position, where more and more they have wings and players that can supplement the defense so that it takes pressure off Trae. I think turning DeJounte Murray into Dyson Daniels was a home run. And I think for Atlanta, assuming Jalen Johnson's back healthy next year, having Trae, Dyson, Jalen, and it does look like the team is moving in the direction now permanently for Onyeka Okongwu to be the starting center, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But this is the core. And I think Atlanta, and plus you have Risa Shea, the number 1 overall pick. So this is the core. Atlanta is inclined, I think, for this to work out. And without, having a total bottoming out, embarrassing experience, I mean, that's the thing. They're still in that range where if you squint, you can see a beautiful painting. If you're not so inclined to see a trash painting or a bad painting, right? And so I think that we're going to see Trae Young and Atlanta come to an agreement on an extension. I don't think that this is a situation like James Harden with the Philadelphia 76ers a couple years ago, where Harden had a player option. He was using the threat of opting in or opting out against Philly because ultimately he wanted to get to the Clippers. Using the option to negotiate a trade, was powerful, but ultimately both the Sixers and Harden, I think, were able to get what they wanted through cooperation. I think in this case, it still makes most sense for Trae to be in Atlanta and Atlanta to be in the Trae business. But then I would just want to point out, so over the past 4 seasons per Cleaning the Glass, Atlanta, they had a top 11 offense, peaking at number 2, but now that's down to 17th. So a big question I have is, can they get back to being a top 10 offense next year, built around Trae Young and the role players they have? Defensively, things are kind of back on the upswing. They were 16th in the NBA in the 2021 season in defense, with a defensive rating of 113.1. Now they're back to around that same mark, 17th in the NBA defense, as I mentioned before, with a defensive rating of 115.6. Scoring continues to rise in the NBA, so it's still about the same level of effectiveness, even though the number has gone up from 113.1 to 115.6. Basically, they're still a middle of the pack defense. They had been much worse in the 3 preceding years, 26th, 21st, and 26th. But I do think that the personnel on this team is improving. And maybe along those lines, we should start talking about Dyson Daniels, because he is going to be eligible for a rookie scale contract extension. Players going into their 4th season on a rookie scale deal, a full year ahead of when they would be a restricted free agent, they can sign a rookie scale extension. Doesn't have to be a max. It can be a negotiated salary. And they have until the start of the season, the start of their 4th season to sign that. So typically we see these deals go down to the wire between team and player, and they get worked out in October. So in Dyson Daniels' case, he is age 22 now. I think that he has been a great perimeter partner for Trae Young because of his ability to force turnovers. He has great size. He can take on the best perimeter assignment on the other team. So in a playoff environment, that could be taking on a small forward, or it could be taking on a point guard so that Trae Young doesn't have to guard that player. I think about, against Cleveland, I would probably put Dyson Daniels on Donovan Mitchell. Trae Young will have to do his best against Garland, but at least it's a like-for-like smaller guard matchup. Daniels recently became the youngest player to reach 200-plus steals in a single season, eclipsing the record set by Magic Johnson, who is slightly older. At that time, he was 23. This is the first 200-steal season in the NBA period since 2009. Shout out to Chris Paul. And Atlanta's defense was number 4 in the NBA in forcing turnovers, a 15.6% turnover rate. They were only 12th and 16th the previous 2 seasons. So Daniels comes in, this trade with the New Orleans Pelicans, and really makes a difference. I mean, Atlanta's now up to 16.3%, 86th percentile in his possessions on the floor, about 4,700 possessions. They're really forcing turnovers. They're really getting after it. And I think on a Trae Young team where you're probably never going to be able to stop the other team from getting good shots, they can always switch Trae Young in the pick and roll and shoot over the top of him, or go downhill and try to force fouls against him or on the switch. But having Daniels out there causing havoc and getting those turnovers up, that's a great way for Atlanta to try to win some control back, get playing with pace, get out in transition. And I also really like how Daniels has improved offensively. His usage has doubled in Atlanta, now in the 40th percentile of players. He was down in I think the 15th or 20th percentile of players with usage rate when he was in New Orleans. So that's really come up. And his shooting splits are actually pretty solid. About 48% from the field, about 34% from 3. So much improved. Now he's a terrible free throw shooter. Terrible. Career 61%. But when you take all these things together, he's listed at 6'8" for a guard. Here are some names that come to mind in terms of dollar amounts, average annual salary that I think could be relevant for a rookie scale extension between Daniels and Atlanta this October. Herb Jones with the Pelicans. Herb Jones, a very tenacious defender, great on the perimeter against 1-2s and 3s. He got a 4-year, $54 million contract. That's an average annual value of 13.5. I think Daniels has probably cleared that, and as the cap continues to go up, it only makes sense for players to negotiate higher average salaries. I think Atlanta might come in and say, hey, this is a comparison, why don't we bake in some, inflation and call it a day? I think the next mile markers, the next 2 mile markers for me would be more in the $80 to $90 million range. Lou Dort signed a 5-year, $87.5 million deal. That's an average annual value of 17.5. Now, Lou Dort is a more proven shooter, although he's had to develop, OKC's had to develop that skill set. I think Lou Dort is maybe the preeminent bulldog perimeter defender, so strong you can't move him. He's going to fight over the screen almost every time. If you try to take him into the post or inside, he's a stalwart. You can't move him. He fits in perfectly with OKC. I think that this is a good comparison. I think the Daniels side could point to Lou Dort signing that deal when they did and say, hey, with inflation, now we're talking about $100 million over 4 years. Notably, as a rookie scale extension, it's limited to a 4-year contract unless we're talking about a 5-year supermax. So, a lot of rookie scale extensions end up being in that 4 range. Maybe if the salary comes down a little bit, the player asks for a player option in year 4 so they can go back into free agency. Wouldn't be shocked if a compromise here looks like that, where Daniels is able to negotiate a 3+1, 3 years with a player option in year 4, and Atlanta gets a salary that looks kind of like this. Lou Dort for 17.5. Another example, Alex Caruso recently signed a 4-year, $81 million. Now, Caruso is an older player, and I think Daniels maybe has already shown a more dynamic skill set and has the ability to credibly claim to be a younger player on the rise, more skill set development to come. That average annual value, $20.3 million. Now, Caruso is one of the best defenders in the NBA on a per minute basis. I think that average annual value of about $20.3 million, that's going to be a strong comp. I think if I'm Daniels, I don't want to go much below that. And the fact that Dort was able to negotiate a 5-year guaranteed deal, I think something like 4 for 90, 4 for 95, I think could be a great place to end up for both of these teams. The last name I'll mention, Jaden McDaniels, who has had an incredible year in Minnesota, has really, really come into his own as a 3-4 combo. Someone that shoots pretty well on open shots now and is a lengthy defender, someone that really rounds out their lineup, takes on big assignments. He signed a 5-year, $136 million deal. That's on the high end for me. I don't know that Dyson Daniels has the same two-way upside as Jaden McDaniels, but I'll say this. If I'm Dyson Daniels' representation, I go to Atlanta and say, look how well this deal worked out for Minnesota. You have Anthony Edwards as your franchise player. You want to surround him with talented defensive personnel that can hit open shots and walk onto the floor in big environments like the second round against the Denver Nuggets last year. You want someone like that, then we got to talk about a nine figures of salary. Jaden McDaniels got 136. I could see Dyson Daniels trying to anchor to that and then put Atlanta in a position where now we're talking about 4 years for 120. Now, notably, 4 years, $120 million, that is what Atlanta paid Jalen Johnson this past offseason. So he's going to be making $30 million flat each year for the next 4 years. I wonder how close Dyson Daniels could negotiate up to that. And I think one other contract that was signed last year that comes to mind in the rookie scale period was Jalen Suggs for Orlando. This is a perimeter defender, bulldog, tenacious, scrappy, and the idea is that he is going to be elite in his role on an Orlando team that grows and grows over time. Suggs is going to make $35 million next year, and then that salary actually declines so that in his 26-27 season, it's $32,400,000. Then it drops to $29.6 million, and then finally 26.8 and 26.7. That was over a 5-year deal, about $150 million. So there is a range of outcomes. I think Atlanta is going to look at this year with Dyson Daniels as too big of a success to let him walk away. And I think he is exactly the kind of guy, especially when there's going to be a lot of teams with cap space in 2026. I think that you have to keep him from that as best you can and keep him from RFA, keep him from restricted free agency, give him the deal today so that he can't sign somewhere different in July of 2026. Now, just rounding things out with Atlanta, this was the year that they transitioned away from Clint Capela at center, and now Onyeka Okongwu has the job. They gave Onyeka Okongwu a rookie scale extension, 4 years, $62 million. It's going to sit somewhere between 9 and 10% of the salary cap each year through 2028. And that is a bargain deal for a starting center, if that player is producing at a high enough level. In 16 games after the All-Star break, Onyeka is shooting 58.6% from the field, 45.5% from three, which is a really cool development. When he was at USC, he was showing signs of shooting touch, and he's always been a pretty good free throw shooter. So to see that three-point shooting starting to develop is really exciting. His true shooting percentage over that stretch, 65.9%, which is a borderline elite mark. That percentage takes into account that three-point shots are more valuable than two-point shots. And just for raw counting stats, he's playing 31 minutes a game over that stretch, 15.6 points a game, 10.4 rebounds, 2.8 assists. That's a very, very productive offensive big man there. And it's exciting to think, they drafted Onyeka in the lottery of the 2000 draft, but they've had Clint Capela on the roster the entire time. They traded for Clint Capela in season during the 1920 season, and Capela was in his mid-20s. He was a center in the prime of his athleticism, a better defensive player than Onyeka even projected to be, taller, longer wingspan. Capela this year, he started 41 games in the beginning portion of the year, but averaging 8.9 points, 8.5 rebounds. His production is just starting to slip. When they first got Clint in that 1920 season, he was 6th place in Defensive Player of the Year votes. That has definitely started to wane, and I think ultimately, to the extent that there would be regret, Onyeka has been very, very slowly brought along since 2000 because he's been a backup big for them. Meanwhile, Clint Capela, who at a certain point negotiated a contract extension, he's been paid $94 million over the last 5 years. He has been their center. And ultimately, it was time to go in a new direction, make sure that they gave Onyeka a chance to really win the job for the long haul. They drafted him high. They've kept him on the roster. They gave him an extension. And it was time. It was time to give him the job, and he's been earning it. So, again, I think that Atlanta next year, the best case scenario, Jalen Johnson's left torn labrum heals. He's back in the starting lineup. Dyson Daniels and Trae Young as your backcourt. You got Zachary Risichet entering year 2 as a number 1 overall pick, and ideally he'll take a step up. And now Onyeka Okongwu is the long-term center for Atlanta. And their goal is simple. We got to win more games, have a higher playoff seed, have a better chance of advancing in the postseason. And that will justify more contracts, more money for guys like Trae, Dyson, and other players that they want to retain. I'm very curious to see where their draft picks end up and ultimately how they use those. But Atlanta represents a team that is middle of the pack, trying to find advantages where they can, trying to retain talent on reasonable salaries, while also thinking in the long term, are we better off, making this trade or this larger decision, even with the big consequences. So early on, I was sort of hinting at maybe you consider trading Trae Young now, or could Trae Young force their hand and make this offseason dramatic and look to see which teams in 2026 would have the money to offer him as a free agent, right? If the Miami Heat, who project to have a lot of cap space in 2026, if they are somewhere that Trae Young wants to be more than Atlanta, then, we've seen agents as well as the Miami Heat, make that that type of situation precarious. We saw that play out with Damian Lillard in Portland. And ultimately, Portland refused to trade him to Miami. And that had a lot of ripple effects in the Eastern Conference and the NBA at large. I think a Trae Young trade decision, a trade market for a player like Trae Young would be comparable to Dame Lillard, even though Lillard was later in his career at that time. I think it would be comparable. But my prediction is Atlanta's going to do everything they can to get better a year from now, convince Trae that he should want to be there long term, and to hopefully embrace a new era for the franchise where they have a collection of really talented guys and are the envy of other teams in the league, and particularly in the Eastern Conference. I think today, without knowing exactly where the draft picks in 2025 are going to fall, you could argue that being the Wizards or the Hornets or the Brooklyn Nets, who we'll talk about shortly, that there's a lot of hope that comes with those lottery ping pong balls, right? Maybe we'll get a number 1 overall pick. Maybe in a few years, we'll build a title contender. I think alternatively, if you're a fan of the Atlanta Hawks, you can at least tell yourself, I know the guys that I'm rooting for. I see these young players getting better every year. I'm falling in love with this group. At the end of the year for Atlanta wasn't super impressive. And I think a lot of that was when Jalen Johnson got hurt. It made more sense for them to pack it in, kind of count their victories and, take what they could into the 25-26 season. But it's going to be a pivotal season. Let's state that plain. It's going to be a pivotal season for Atlanta next year to convince their fan base, hey, we are going to be a contending team in the years to come. Don't you worry. Next up, a team in a much different and much better, although complicated, set of circumstances. The Boston Celtics. You ever heard of them? Storied franchise. 18 NBA championships, if I'm not mistaken. I'm currently enjoying the Celtic City docu-series on Max. Celtics, as of March 24th, 52-19, well on their way to a playoff appearance, second in the Eastern Conference. Cleaning the glass, expected wins per 82 games, 61.7. So we'll see if they get into that low 60s range. Offensive rating, third in the NBA, 120.9. Defensive rating, sixth in the NBA, 111.7. That's a positive 9.2 net rating, third in the NBA, only behind Oklahoma City and Cleveland. Let's look at their financial fundamentals. 10 contracts under team control, 0 restricted free agents, 0 player options or ETOs, and they have 3 cap holds on the books. They do have their own 2025 first-round pick. But where we're going to spend most of our time talking about the Celtics today is tracking just how challenging it is to support a team like this financially. And we are of course, going to talk about the recent sale of the Boston Celtics. An initial valuation of $6.1 billion. Now the new record for the sale of a North American sports franchise. Incredible stuff. Incredible to see numbers like that. Dunked on and their cap sheet, the Celtics likely are minus $76 million in cap space for the 25-26 season, and that includes being $23 million. Minus $23 million from the second apron. They are $23 million into the second apron. This would mean that they are over the second apron for multiple seasons, which comes with its own penalty. Should the Celtics not be able to get out of the second apron between now and the end of the 25-26 season, they would actually face the penalty of having their 2032 first-round pick frozen, which means that they wouldn't be able to trade it, and it would fall to the bottom of the first round if they were not able to get out of the second apron for 3 consecutive years. So if you're asking yourself, the second apron seems prohibitive. Seems like if you're in the second apron, you cannot operate like any other NBA team would otherwise be able to. Seems like that soft cap, that soft salary cap environment does not apply to second apron teams. And the answer is yes, you are correct. Effectively, in this second apron environment, if you're above the second apron for multiple seasons, you're hard capped. You're hard capped. There are other restrictions, including not being able to make trades where you have to add up salaries. In other words, every trade you do, you have to send out one player and get a player in return that makes less money. And it just makes trades very difficult to pull off when you're above the second apron. And if you're above the second apron for multiple seasons, you have this frozen first round pick, among others. You can't use the mid-level exception to sign a veteran, for example. But in terms of raw dollars, the Celtics are facing a $513 million tax bill. That is the salary cap that they are well in excess of, plus their repeater tax penalties. So don't you forget, not only do we have these aprons that we got to track, you're in the messiest kitchen of all time. You're not wearing one apron, you're wearing two. But even if you're, notwithstanding the first or second apron, if you're above the tax, you are a tax team. Not only, you are paying out tax penalties to all of the non-tax teams in the NBA. And if you're in the tax for multiple seasons, there are repeating penalties on top of that. The NBA's luxury tax system is set up so that penalties become more punitive the further teams go beyond the tax line. So, for example, in the 24-25 season, the size of those tax brackets are actually in the process of increasing as the same rate as the salary cap, which, as we discussed, is 10%. The cap rose 10% year over year for 25-26. That's why the tax line moves up, but also the different tax brackets. First tax bracket, you pay a rate of $1.5 for every dollar. And that tax bracket is, if you're like within 5 or 6 million of the tax. If you're between 5-ish and 10-ish million of the tax, the rate jumps up to 1.75. Between 10-ish and 15-ish, 2.5. Between 15.5 and 20.6, 3.25. And then it keeps going up 50 cents per dollar for every bracket above that. So we actually, for the 24-25 season, just to give you an example, for a team that is about $31 million over the tax, they would be paying $4.25 for every dollar in that tax bracket. So these things compound and compound and compound. And so I'll leave it there for now. There's plenty of places that one can read all the specifics. I don't know if it's the best radio to go, kind of line by line on the penalties. But we can skip to the final calculation and say, again, the Celtics are facing a $513 million bill with the repeater tax. But then, as an example, Drew Holiday is on the team, one of the best players of his era, certainly one of the defensive stars of his generation, essential to last year's title team. He's set to make $32.4 million next year, $34.8 million the following year, and then a team option for $37.2 million in the 27-28 season. As a reminder, the Celtics are about $23 million over the second apron already as things stand, and they don't even have a full roster. So if they were able to trade Drew Holiday for, a player, making, half that, right? So if Drew is making 32.4 next year, let's say they were able to find someone that's making
$17, $18 million a year. In just big round numbers, that would save them about $200 million in tax penalties. It would bring their overall bill from about 513 down to about 315, 320, depending on specifics. I mean, this is the landscape now that we are in, where a team like the Boston Celtics, who they have two homegrown stars, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, who are making a combined $108 million next year. And then they've made very good trades to get great players like Drew Holiday, like Kristaps Porzingis, like Derek White. And those guys being in the $28, $30, $32 million range, these are the salaries that the Celtics have to think very deeply about moving just to spare themselves some of these huge payments. Now, alternatively, we just saw the Celtics sell for an initial valuation of $6.1 billion. It appears that the final sale price of the Celtics could actually be near a $7 billion valuation, because the Grosbecks, they plan to sell 51% of their ownership shares to William Chisholm now, and then the rest in 2028 for an $8 billion evaluation of that 49%. So when you average those out, you're going to get closer to a $7 billion valuation. And that is the carrot, right? You're giving Chisholm what he wants, which is the Celtics. Over those next 3 years, where Chisholm is going to have 51% of the Celtics, so he's going to have majority control, he's going to have majority vote, but he won't be able to unilaterally do everything he wants just yet with the franchise. He needs the Grosbecks in-house with their other 49% to take care of the day-to-day, help with the transition, make it as smooth as possible. And it appears that the Grosbecks are very deliberate with this term, that they weren't going to sell to someone that wasn't going to keep them involved for those 3 transition years. Now, we're going to see, because if you buy something for $6.1, 7, $8 billion, right, in that range, you want full control and you want it as soon as possible. And so, Wyc Grousbeck is saying publicly, like, hey, I'm still here to lead the franchise as governor. The Celtics expect Wyc to remain as governor of the team until that second closing in 2028. We'll see exactly how that plays out. That is not what happened in Dallas between Mark Cuban and Miriam Adelson and Patrick DuPont. Notably, the Grosbecks, they originally bought the Celtics for a $360 million valuation in 2002. And so they have more, they have made their money and then some. Their reasons for selling the team are apparently for estate and family planning considerations. The right time to sell, the right time to, take this money, put it into a trust and fund generations of their family for years to come, and to offload the burden of funding the Celtics team and building a contender in the 21st century of the NBA, where it's very, very expensive. Mark Cuban has talked about this. Part of why he sold his majority share in the Dallas Mavericks is because it's getting too expensive to compete. It costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And so to bring it back to this Celtics cap sheet situation, these are going to be unpopular decisions if the Celtics decide to trade Drew Holiday or Kristaps Porzingis, to trade away Sam Hauser on a $10 million contract, right? He signs a a long-term extension with the Celtics, which is only about 6% of the salary cap. But that $10 million salary, because of these repeater tax penalties and being in the second apron, have huge ramifications and consequences for the Celtics. That $10 million salary for him, or let's say Al Horford, who's a free agent, let's say the Celtics want to bring him back for $10 million, that's going to accrue another $60 to $70 million in penalties each. So it's punitive. It's really rough out here. I think that there is an argument that the NBA overcorrected a problem, which they saw it as teams like Golden State and Boston and the LA Clippers, or even now the Phoenix Suns under new ownership, Matt Ashbia, who is spending lots and lots of money on the team. You know, the most liquid and financially powerful ownership groups do have an advantage if they are willing to pay these luxury tax penalties. And so the second apron, not only are the repeater tax penalties more punitive than ever before, but the second apron as an effective hard cap and backstop, which means like, hey, like, yes, you can walk yourself into that second apron problem, but to get out of it, you got to go through the pain of trading away good players and or facing really heavy burdens on your trade activity and your ability to sign free agents of any kind, your ability to participate in the buyout market, which was always a cheap play for contending teams late in the season to sign veterans on buyouts. You can't do that if you're a second apron team. So I'm really interested to see what the Celtics team is going to do. In some ways, it's all speculation, and it's also going to really depend on what happens in June. If the Celtics win a second title in a row, I would find it very hard to believe that the Celtics would break up a championship core. Now, you could argue that trading Drew Holiday for a slightly less expensive player and then doing what you can on the margins to reload your bench, even if that means moving on from Horford or trading Hauser. I mean, I think there's a middle ground where as long as you have Tatum, Brown, Derek White, one of Porzingis and Drew, and then some of these younger guys we're starting to see them play more minutes. Schneiderman's been playing more. They're going to have their own first-round pick this year. But it's not a great place to be. And, you know, one thing I'll say, you know, I thought this is an interesting stat. Over the past 45 years, only 5 title-winning teams were not, in fact, led by a player who won an NBA MVP or would go on to win an NBA MVP. And those teams were all 3 Pistons titles teams, 1989, 1990, and 2004. The 2019 Toronto Raptors, Kawhi Leonard is not an MVP winner. And last year's Celtics. And it is unlikely that Jason Tatum will win an MVP in his career. I would put it at maybe a 10% chance. I don't think Jaylen Brown would ever win a regular season MVP award. So you could argue that this Celtics team was more closely resembling an ensemble team relative to the historical realities of most NBA champions have an all-time great MVP type player. Not that Jason Tatum isn't worthy of MVP votes. I think this year, for example, he's a top 5 MVP vote getter. He's just not at the level of SGA or Jokic. And I would predict that will kind of be his career, that he'll be a 3rd or 4th or 5th place vote kind of guy, but not a full-blown MVP. Can the Celtics continue to compete for titles without a 5, 6, 7, 8-man rotation of very, very, very good players, a strong ensemble? Can they compete for titles in this second apron environment? And at what point would breaking up Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum become the most financially savvy thing to do if the real problem is you can't afford to build a bench, right? If you can't afford to build a good bench when you have two players making $108 million combined and rising, each player, being entitled to 35% of the salary cap, then at some point you would need to consider moving one of them. And that would be, and I'm not a Celtics fan, but I think that would be the saddest thing of it all, is if in the years to come, it's delaying, but ultimately the Celtics deciding to trade away either Brown or Tatum because they can't afford to have both guys. I think that would be a really bad outcome for the NBA long term if you had an example of a team competing for championships, winning a championship even, but then still breaking up their star duo, two guys they drafted and they developed. But we'll see. There is time to see what exactly the Celtics do. They're fortunate to have very good players on fairly priced deals if they open up salary a different way, either by trading Holiday or trading Porzingis. Time will tell what they do, and ultimately whether or not they can beat the Cavs in the East, and whether or not they can beat a team like the Thunder or another Western Conference opponent in the finals. That is going to ultimately decide what the Celtics look like in the 2025-26 season. And last but not least for today's episode, Brooklyn Nets. We're going to talk about a team that is all the way at the beginning of the process and not the end of the process, like the Boston Celtics. We're talking about a team that is in the beginning of their rebuild, a team that is still very much trying to acquire the core pieces of the next great Brooklyn Nets team. This season, 23-48, 12th in the Eastern Conference as of March 24th. Per Cleaning the Glass, their expected wins per 82 games was 23.8. So in some ways, they've overachieved. They're going to end up somewhere in the mid-20s for wins. They're going to end up somewhere in the lottery odds of maybe the 7th best odds or the 8th best odds for the number 1 overall pick. They own their own first-round pick. They actually traded for it back. They had to reacquire their own first-round pick from the Houston Rockets. And they actually sent Phoenix Suns picks to the Rockets. And so now there is a popular theory that the Rockets are going to be able to extract talent from Phoenix, maybe even Kevin Durant, by trading Phoenix their own first-round picks back. We'll see. We'll see if that ends up happening, but pretty good strategy for Houston. On the season, Brooklyn Nets, very, very bad offensively, a 109.2 offensive rating, 28th in the NBA. A little bit better on the defensive end, 116.5, 22nd in the NBA in general. Jordi Fernandez, their head coach, has done a very good job of making sure they're playing tough and playing competitive, even though their roster has swung quite a bit. Every month of the year, their team looks a little bit different. They traded off, some of their best ball handlers when the team was winning a little bit too much, when they were playing a little too frisky, and so that brought their offensive rating down sufficiently so that they could lose sufficiently for lottery purposes. In terms of the team, and so their net rating on the year or up to March 24th, negative 7.2, 26th in the NBA. Looking at their financial fundamentals, they have 7 contracts under team control, not including Jalen Wilson, who can become a restricted free agent. And I have a feeling that what the Nets are going to do is they're going to decline his option, let him go into restricted free agency, and they're going to make an offer sheet for Jalen Wilson that is competitive, that he will sign. It will allow them to have Jalen Wilson on the books for a multi-year deal. He is one of 4 restricted free agents the Nets will have match rights for. That also includes Cam Thomas. And then the Nets also have 4 cap holds on the book. So overall, they likely have about $67.7 million in cap space. They could get there if they renounce all the cap holds other than Cam Thomas and Jalen Wilson, and then they have 4 guaranteed contracts. And if they use their 4 first-round picks, as we'll get to, though, I don't know exactly what their cap space is going to provide them. And so, in general, the flexibility of cap space is a good thing. But nothing beats talent. And right now, the Nets don't have that much talent. They don't really have much of anything tied down. I would expect them to max out that draft capital, try to bring as many talented rookies into next season as possible, try to get Cam Thomas and Jalen Wilson back on decent deals in RFA. Clearly, this team isn't going to have tax concerns next year. If you're curious, some guys that are going to be free agents or the Nets might have access to as free agents with that cap space, LeBron James is a player option. I don't think he's leaving LA for Brooklyn. Fred VanVleet, Houston has a team option for him. And so similar to when Fred went to Houston in the first place, maybe if Houston let Fred go, maybe he would go to Brooklyn for the highest price possible and he would provide some stability in Brooklyn. But I don't think that's a perfect fit. Then you got a bunch of names here: Kyrie, James Harden, Chris Middleton, Julius Randle, John Collins. All these guys have player options. And for different reasons, I don't see them signing with the Brooklyn Nets. Then you get into a range where it's mostly veterans who would probably prefer going to a contending team over taking a higher salary with Brooklyn. Brook Lopez, Clint Capela, Bruce Brown Jr., Malcolm Brogdon, Miles Turner, Tim Hardaway Jr., Duncan Robinson as a player option. He'll probably pick that up for Miami. D'Angelo Russell just got let go by the Nets, so I don't think he's going to be back. Karis LeVert, Luke Kennard, Naz Reid. Naz Reid is a very interesting name. Probably the first name that really has me thinking. Here's some more veterans: Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, Steven Adams, Marvin Bagley, Bobby Portis is a player option that he'll probably pick up unless Milwaukee decides to go in a different direction. And then we get into the weeds with names that don't really move the needle one way or the other. If we wanted to look at just restricted free agents, just players that are restricted, they can't outright sign with another team, but Brooklyn Nets could leverage their cap space and basically say, hey, we're going to make you a huge offer. Hopefully your incumbent team doesn't match, and then we can steal you away. Josh Giddey, Jonathan Kuminga, Davion Mitchell, Zaire Williams, Trae Mann, Isaiah Jackson, who unfortunately got hurt for the Pacers earlier this year, Quentin Grimes. That's a cool name. Day'Ron Sharpe and Cam Thomas are Brooklyn Nets RFA players. Santi Aldama. And not a lot of other options after that. And so I ran through those names quick. I didn't stay on any of those names too long. I just wanted to let you know that Brooklyn Nets have a lot of cap space, but there aren't a ton of obvious targets in free agency to use that cap space on. I think it's more likely that they try to disrupt the NBA trade market, volunteer themselves as a dumping ground for bad contracts, bad salary, try to acquire more draft picks in the future that way, maybe try to acquire the right young talent that isn't in a perfect situation, so that team is looking to trade that guy at an opportune time. Maybe that's a way for the Nets. They could trade some of they have 4 draft picks in June's draft. Maybe they trade some of those picks away for younger players on rookie scale contracts. They have a lot of flexibility, but I don't know if they have many apparently good options. I mean, it's going to be an interesting summer for them. What is made even more interesting is that they still have Cam Johnson on the roster, their best player. He is set to make $20.5 million next year. That's only 13.3% of the salary cap, and then $22.5 million the following year. Notably, his salary was 22.5 this year, goes down to 20.5, and then back up to 22.5 in 26-27 season. One of the more unique salary structures in the league. Just finished his age 28 season. I think you could argue that he doesn't really fit the Nets timeline. Like, I don't know that he is going to be in his prime still playing at a great level or a really good level. I don't know that Cam Johnson is a great player. I think he's a really, really good role player. And so it was curious that the Nets didn't trade him this year, but I really think the evidence suggests that they just didn't love any of the offers they got for Cam Johnson. And instead of selling him low, they wanted to take things into the summer where maybe they could just find a better trade partner. If you were going to be critical, you would compare the situation to the Washington Wizards holding on to Kyle Kuzma at the trade deadline last year. Reportedly, they turned down 2 first-round picks. There was a rumor that Kuzma was desired by the Dallas Mavericks, and the Wizards said no, so the Mavericks ended up trading for P.J. Washington instead, and that trade has worked out well for the Hornets and the Mavericks, and the Wizards had to settle for traded Kuzma this year for Chris Middleton's quote-unquote bad salary. He has a player option for $31 million that he's probably going to pick up this summer. A.J. Johnson was a low first-round pick for the Bucks. You know, has shown some signs of something, but I wouldn't say that A.J. Johnson is the equivalent of a unprotected future first-round pick at this point. Maybe more of like an early second-round pick value. And the Wizards got a 2028 first-round pick swap with the Bucks. That could actually be pretty valuable, but it's not the same thing as owning a first-round pick outright. And so again, I think the argument is if you wait too long to trade a guy like Kuzma or a guy like Cam Johnson or a guy like DeAndre Hunter, what does the trade market become as that player gets older and gets closer to free agency instead of trading someone when they have many years left on their contract and many years ahead of them at a certain level? Cleveland was able to acquire DeAndre Hunter without trading a first-round pick. They traded Karis LeVert and George Niang, plus the ability for Atlanta to swap first-round picks. So again, there's a difference between trading out an unprotected first-round pick, where now you just lose control of that asset entirely. The pick swap, Atlanta now has an option. Like maybe Atlanta has a better record in 2026 than Cleveland. And actually, I'm looking at the notes there. So Atlanta has the right to swap with the least favorable of Cleveland and Utah. So I mean, it's not that great of an asset. In 2028, Atlanta has the right to swap with the least favorable of Cleveland and Utah. So let's assume Utah is going to be bad for a while longer. Who knows when they'll be good again? If Atlanta finished a little better than Cleveland, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh, like maybe we have the opportunity to swap picks, and maybe that improves Atlanta's position 5 or 10 spots in the first round that year. That could be cool. Now, Cleveland could still be really great in 2028. So again, I think Cleveland did a great job of turning those 2 swaps, which may or may not turn into anything, plus a 2027 second round pick, a 2029 second round pick, and a 2031 second round pick. So they traded 5 draft assets that all adds up to a whole lot of not so sure. Adds up to a whole lot of maybe none of this stuff is going to work out all that well for Atlanta. And they get off of George Niang's salary, where, he's a good role player, but he's not anything to write home about. You can definitely replace his skill set. They get DeAndre Hunter. DeAndre Hunter, a 6'8", two-way player, once thought to be a light version of Kawhi Leonard. Now he's more of like a sharp shooting wing player with size that can slot in and play decent defense and rebound. And, I think DeAndre Hunter is the kind of pickup that if Cleveland wins the championship, you look back and say that trade was a huge reason why they didn't have someone on the team like him before. So anyway, I'm bringing up these examples because I think for the Brooklyn Nets, as the seller, from the seller's position, they just decided like, hey, we're not going to give Cam Johnson away for nothing. That the comparison would also be with the Chicago Bulls, where they have Nikola Vucevic, and there's been rumors that contending teams like the Lakers wanted him or the Warriors wanted him, but they didn't want to trade a first-round pick. They only wanted to trade seconds. And if you're the Bulls, you're like, look, like, we'll just keep Vucevic. He scores, he rebounds, gives the fans something to root for. Now, another day we'll talk about the Chicago Bulls being just mired in mediocrity. I would rather be the Brooklyn Nets than the Chicago Bulls. And even if Cam Johnson is inevitably going to get traded in the future for a package of pick swaps and second rounders and, you know, the exchanging of small salaries, if that's inevitably what the trade market is for a guy like Cam Johnson, then the Nets might as well hold on to him, because in the short term, he is such a useful shooter, and I think you can credibly build an NBA offense, an NBA quality offense with him on the floor. That maybe the plan is, hey, we're going to have young guys that we want to develop. We might as well keep Cam Johnson out there for culture, for leadership. You know, someone who can space the floor and make the offense run a certain way. You know, he's a good player. He played 32 minutes this year per game. His usage is in the 80th percentile, 21.7% usage rate. According to Cleaning the Glass, he's scoring 128.2 points per 100 shot attempts. That's a 95th percentile rate. You know, that goes to show you he's an elite catch and shoot player. You know, he's able to chase his defender all around the floor, find openings, catch and shoot, and he shoots very, very efficiently. Also, his playmaking is coming up. His assist rate is in the 85th percentile now. And he's a career 3.2 threes made per 36 minutes on 39.4%. Just a great shooter, a career true shooting percentage of 60.4. Like, this is someone who can play his role on offense. I like DeAndre Hunter better for Cleveland. I think that was a question, was would the Cavs want to go all in on a Cam Johnson trade? But I think in both cases, they weren't willing to trade an unprotected first-round pick. I think they only had their 2031 unprotected pick that they could move, and they were like, you know what? No, we're going to keep it. We'll take this offer, you know, or we'll make an offer that's good enough with Atlanta to get Hunter. But if the Nets don't want to do Cam Johnson, then we won't lose sleep. I think Cam Johnson would have had a hard time staying on the floor in a potential Boston Celtics series defensively. I think DeAndre Hunter is going to stand up way better than him. So I think the Cavs did all right. I think ultimately the trade market for Cam Johnson just wasn't quite good enough, and it just made more sense for them to keep him. Kind of a similar story with Nick Claxton, although I think there's an argument that Nick Claxton's actually become a negative trade value. You know, he's a skinny, lanky center defensively that doesn't play with a lot of force. He's not a great rebounder. He's not a great shot blocker. The Nets gave him a deal where he's going to make $25.4 million next year. That's 16.4% of the salary cap. $23 million the following year, about 13% of the salary cap. And then in the 27-28 season, his salary keeps dropping. That's the most attractive part. His salary keeps dropping. So he's only going to make $20.9 million in the 27-28 year. That's only 11% of the salary cap. So I think on the one hand, you got a center who's entering his late 20s, a good center on team control on a descending salary. I think alternatively, it's like, how valuable is the 30th best center in the NBA? How valuable is the 35th best center in the NBA? And unfortunately, Claxton this year, I think he's taken a step back in terms of his effectiveness as a two-way player. I think if Claxton had a stronger year, that contract would be really interesting on the trade market this summer. But I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to trade him for much positive value. I guess where I'll wrap things up for talking about the Brooklyn Nets, and again, we talked about the Atlanta Hawks, a team that's in the middle of the pack. We talked about the Boston Celtics, a contending team in this new CBA environment. For a team like the Brooklyn Nets, restricted free agency, I think, is where their bread is going to be buttered this summer. Hopefully they can come up with a nice contract or two with that cap space. They have their own RFA guys like Jalen Wilson, Cam Thomas. Want to put it out there that Cam Thomas is such a good scorer, such a microwave scorer. Even if he was only thought of as a sixth man long term, I really do think that his value is at a level, you know, where he really shouldn't take anything less than 22, $24 million per year, just because we know he can score in bunches. He's the kind of guy that can run pick and roll very credibly. I wonder if the Jalen Green contract is going to be a decent comparison. So Jalen Green in October negotiated the first ever 2+1 rookie extension. So that's 2 guaranteed seasons. And then in year 3, there's a player option. So Jalen Green could hit the market at age 26 after guaranteeing himself, plenty of money on his rookie deal. And then the first 2 years of this contract, he could hit free agency at age 26 and basically sign a much larger 4 or 5 year deal. I wonder if that's the construction that we could see for Cam Thomas here, where it's in RFA, so that's a little different. And we've seen 2+1s in RFA before. It was the timing of the Jalen Green deal that made it unique. We had never seen a player as a rookie scale extension in October before that deadline passed signing a 2+1. But I think in restricted free agency in July, it would not shock me at all if Cam Thomas was able to come to an agreement with the Nets, a 2+1 type structure where he's able to hit free agency again in the short term if he's able to play at a certain level. If he's scoring 22, 23 points a game, like he would be able to go back into free agency and get a lot of money. And I think if you're the Brooklyn Nets, all you're really trying to do is get him back in a Brooklyn Nets jersey for another year. Hopefully he gets healthy, proves his ability to score a lot of points, and then you could look to trade him. But we'll see what the Nets end up doing. Excited to be previewing the NBA offseason across the entire NBA. Next up, we're going to talk about 6 interesting teams in the Eastern Conference, a range of cap sheets and circumstances. Appreciate you subscribing to the Collective Basketball Agreements podcast. If you like what you're hearing and you want more of it, subscribe to my Substack at that Joe Mags, or just look up the Collective Basketball Agreements podcast on Substack. That's where you're going to get my updates every Monday, different basketball stories and links to the podcasts. You can like and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. But I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm your host, Joe Manganiello. Thanks for listening.